So the thing about stories, as any storyteller will tell you, is that stories travel, and they love to travel. And they travel mostly on the tongues of people that tell those stories. And sometimes they might make a little tweak here, a little change there, a little flourish or flair here. But the essence, the truth and the heart in that story is something that is shared throughout every version of that particular tale. So this story is a story that's inspired by a tale that I have told in the past called the Storytelling Stone, and it's a story from the First Nation people of America. But this story I've taken and I've transposed it into a village in rural Norfolk. And in this village there lived a woman, a quiet woman she was. She kept herself to herself. And she hadn't lived in the village for very long, and nobody really knew where she had come from or what her life had been like before she moved to this quiet Norfolk village, which happened to be on the edge of the woods. Now, they were all curious, as people are, especially in small communities. Everybody likes to know each other's business, and people will gather in the pub or the local shop or at the school gate, and they will share stories. And their favourite stories to tell are usually the stories about the people in their community. But nobody really knew much about the quiet woman because, as I said, she kept herself to herself, and she liked it that way. Now, the people in the village, they did try to start conversations with her, but it never really went the way they felt it should. They would fall back on some of the finest topics of English conversation, like the weather, for example. So on a particularly wet day, when the quiet woman walked into the village shop and was drenched, soaking wet, and the woman behind the counter said, "Oh," she said, "shocking weather today, isn't it?" And the quiet woman said, "Yes, isn't it wonderful?" Well, that wasn't exactly what they were expecting. And they didn't know what to do with that. And then over time, they stopped trying to engage her in conversation. The quiet woman noticed that quite often when she walked into the village shop to buy her groceries, that people who would be talking would go quiet the moment she walked in. And she felt sad about that, but it was also okay because she didn't really know how to make small talk. A thing that I personally think is rather overrated, small talk. I rather enjoy big talk myself, and of course stories. But it was okay because the quiet woman, she was happy with her own company. She loved her garden, and she spent many hours tending to her vegetables and her flowers in the garden. And every afternoon, after she had eaten her lunch made from vegetables in her garden, she'd go out into the woods and she would collect kindling wood for her fire that she would have later on that evening. And she would sit by the fire, read a book, listen to music, or just sit quietly with her own thoughts. And over the months and the years that she lived in that village, she got to know every part of that woodland. Every tree was like a friend, like a member of her family. And the birds and the squirrels. And she walked in those woods every day, through every season. And she had particular favourite spots that she liked to sit in at particular times of the year. And in the autumn, she particularly loved to sit with the oak tree. Brother Oak, she called him. And she would lean her weight against this mighty oak and feel that solid connection with the earth and feel held by this wonderful, magnificent tree and feeling held by the earth itself. And then one day, something unusual, something unexpected happened. As she sat there leaning her weight against that mighty trunk of that beautiful oak, she felt a strange rumbling that felt like it was coming up from the earth and coming up into the trunk, and she could feel it in her body. And then she heard, "Would you like me to tell you a story?" And to begin with, she thought that she was hearing things, but actually it was the strangest thing, because she wasn't hearing this. It wasn't like a voice that she could hear with her ears. It was like the words were coming straight into her body, straight into her heart and her soul. She leaned back, she looked up at the sky, looking up through the leaves, which were now turning from green to brown and gold in the autumn. And then she felt it again, she heard it again. "Would you like me to tell you a story?" Yes. And so that mighty tree that she had been getting to know all through these years began to tell her a story. And oh, what a story it was. And I'm afraid that is another story for another time, and not one that I have for today. And she went home that evening and she sat by her fire and she thought about that story, and she told that story again to herself out loud. And then she went the next day back into the woods, and she couldn't resist to go and sit once more, leaning her weight against that beautiful oak tree. And then she heard it again, and she felt the rumbling. "Would you like me to tell you a story?" Yes. And oh, this story, well, if it wasn't as good as the one she'd heard the day before, well, it was even better. And she told herself again the story that night as she sat by her fire. She went back the next day and the same thing happened, and the next day and the next and the next. And every day as she went to collect her kindling in the woods, throughout the winter, into the spring, into the summer, and back round to the autumn again, a story every single day for a year and a day. Until the day came when she went and she sat beneath that mighty oak and she leaned back her weight, expecting. But nothing came. And she sat and she thought about this, and she thought about all the stories that the oak tree had shared with her. The stories of the many trees in the woods, of the birds and the animals. Stories that made her smile, stories that made her laugh, stories that warmed her heart, and stories that made her heart feel like it was going to break. And she went home that evening and she sat by her fire and she looked into the flames and she thought about all of those stories that she had heard for a year and a day. She knew what she had to do. And the next day, she wrote out notes for every single villager and she put them through their letterboxes, asking for them to bring their empty jars and to put them on her doorstep. And the neighbours, well, they were curious about this strange request and they couldn't resist. And within 2 or 3 days, there were jars piling up on the quiet woman's doorstep. And inside each one of those jars, she placed a small candle. And one evening, as the sun was setting and the darkness was creeping in, the villagers noticed a strange glow outside of their windows, and coming out of their doors they saw a path leading out through the village, lit with these glass jar lanterns. And so they followed this trail of lanterns, and it took them deep into the woods and into a clearing. And in that clearing, there was a fire. And sitting by that fire was the quiet woman. And she gestured and she beckoned for them to sit and to join her by the fire. And so they did. And they sat and they wondered what was going to happen next. And then the quiet woman spoke. And she told a story. The first story that the oak tree had shared with her. And then when she had finished that story, she told another. And she told another. And they loved those stories just as much as she did. And when she finished her third story, they said, "Tell us another." And she said, "I will tell you these stories another day." And so this became a regular fixture in the diary of all the villagers, that they would gather around the fire in the woods, and the quiet woman would share these stories. And as the time went on, people would say, "That story reminds me of a story that I once heard," and they shared that story, and that would remind somebody else of another story. And so it was that they all shared their stories, and there were more than enough stories to go around, because stories do have a way of travelling and of finding the ears and the hearts that they know will listen.
So these are stories, several of the stories that we're sharing with you are about Norfolk, and the thing with stories is stories travel. And some stories are particular to a certain area, and some stories, well, they could be here or they could be anywhere. And this is one of those stories which could be anywhere. But perhaps you know this person. It's about old Arthur. He'd worked the land all his life. He was farming when we had Shire horses still working, pulling the punches and whatever, pulling the ploughs, punch horses, pulling the ploughs. And he could remember all the hedgerows still intact. He could remember when he had his break, he would hear all the birds chirping away in the background and not all the noise that we hear now. And he had a good life. You know, he didn't have lots of money, but he had a lovely life because he connected with the outdoors all the time. And he eventually retired. And he set himself up his little garden, little vegetable patch and whatever, and a few flowers for his wife. And he even started looking after bees. And he was the kind of man that he would get the honey at the end of the season, but he would always leave some honey for the bees. He didn't put in sugar water. He would leave some of the honey for the bees, which is the best thing to do for the bees, if you're keeping bees. And so it was. And, well, Arthur enjoyed his retirement, but, you know, he got older and older and older. And one day when he was quite frail, there was a knock at the door, and he went to the door and he opened the door, and there stood Death. Well, the first thing Arthur did is he said, come in, sit at my table, have a cup of tea." And he poured Death a cup of tea, and he cut him a piece of cake. And they got chatting, and Death said, "You don't seem very afraid of me, Arthur." "That's because I'm not," said Arthur. "I'd like to give you a little bit more time, Arthur, but I've got a little test for you. I wonder if you can tell me what you had on your 10th birthday, what your mother made for you. I'll come back next week. I'll give you a week to work it out." So Death just went. So Arthur got thinking about it. Well, he was an old man. He couldn't remember what he'd had on his 10th birthday. Well, he went out into the garden in the early evening. It was in the summertime, still light, as he did every evening, to share a little bit of his food with the birds. They'd little robin and the wren and the blue tits and whatever, they'd come and land on his table and take little bits and pieces of him. The sparrows would come close and he'd feed them. And well, he said out loud to the birds, "I can't remember what I had on my 10th birthday. what I had to eat, what Mother made for me? Well, one of the birds, because in stories birds can speak, you see, there's magic happens. One of the birds said, I can remember. Your mother made you a beautiful fruit and nut cake and you came and shared some of it with us. It was delicious. And of course Arthur could remember that then. Arthur finished up, well, a week passed, Death came, there was a knock at the door. Arthur opened it. Sure enough, Death was standing there. Come in, he said. Sit yourself down. And Death sat down. Cup of tea, piece of cake. And he poured some tea, cut a piece of cake for Death. And they got chatting once again. Can you remember what you had on your 10th birthday, Arthur? Yes, Mother made me a fruit and nut cake. You're good, said Death. I've got another task for you, Arthur. I'm going to give you another week. Tell me what you had on your 5th birthday. What did your mother make for you on your 5th birthday? And Death just, off he went again. Arthur thought, well, I couldn't remember my 10th birthday. There's no way I'm going to remember my 5th birthday. And that evening he went outside once again and broke some crumbs and bits and pieces for the birds, and they all came, and he found himself talking to the birds once again, and he said, I can't remember for the life of me what Mother baked me on my 5th birthday. One of the birds said, I can. She made you some beautiful cookies, some lovely biscuits, and you shared them with us. Ah, said Arthur, yes, I remember those now, yes. Well, the week passed. Death came again, a knock at the door. Arthur knew who it was by now. Come in, he said. Got the cup of tea and the piece of cake going. Death looked at him and said, well, Arthur, can you remember what your mother made for you on your 5th birthday? Beautiful biscuits. Said Death. Oh, you're good, Arthur, you're good. I'm going to give you another week, Arthur. I'm enjoying this game, said Death. Let's see if what you can remember what the first thing was that your father said to you when you were a baby. And with that, Death was gone. Well, Arthur thought, well, I'm never going to remember that. And how on earth would the birds even know what that was? Because I was inside the house. Well, Arthur thought, well, it's my time. This is it. Death will take me next time he visits. So, well, he did the same thing as he always did. He took himself out into the garden to have his evening meal and his cup of tea and his bit of cake, and once again he shared bits and pieces with the birds. And he once again was speaking out loud and said, I wish I could remember what my father said to me on the day that I was born. And he looked at the birds, and the birds looked at each other. They shrugged their shoulders. They had no idea what had been said. And some of the birds kind of put their heads down because they knew what it meant. Well, Arthur finished up his meal, went to bed. It was time for Death to come once again. Death knocked on the door, and Arthur had realised that this was his time. This was his time. Death would be taking him today. And he invited him in. He said, please sit down, Death, and here's a cup of tea, here's a piece of cake. And they got talking once again. And Death looked at Arthur and said, well, Arthur, can you remember the first thing that your father said to you when you were born and he held you in his arms? And Arthur didn't respond immediately. He got up. He got his little old body over to the window. He put his hand on the handle of the window and he said, let's open the window and listen to the birds, shall we? And Death looked at him. How did you know that, Arthur? How did you know that's what your father said to you? And Death left. And Arthur lived for quite a bit longer. And that's the story of Arthur and his meeting with Death.
Trees. I love trees. There are some beautiful trees in this woods and many of the walks I go on. We have a very different relationship with trees, most of us, than people from years and years ago, our ancestors, many, many hundreds of years ago. revered trees. They thought trees were sacred, and they all had different sorts of properties. So holly was seen as a tree which would protect you against lightning. So lots and lots of trees would have a holly. Yew was another protection tree, and a bit of a grandmother tree, and very sacred, which is why there are yews in most churchyards, because of course the churches were built onto much older sacred sites. And the rowan, people would have rowan to protect them against witches and witchcraft. And then there's the alder. And the alder, well, that's A-L-D-E-R as opposed to elder. The alder is a tree which it's both fire and water. So it's a bit of a magical tree, really, and it's a tree of protection. But alder, there's been writings about alder all the way back to the Greeks, like Socrates and Plato. And alder, and you might not know this, alder is what Venice was built on. And around here, when they find the walkways through the reeds, which we have lots of here and lots of in the kind of the marshes and the estuaries, alder is a tree that goes as hard as concrete as long as it's wet. Once it's dried out, it just decays. So anywhere where they wanted walkways through the rivers and things, they would put alder in. But people knew that you should never cut an alder tree down, because the spirit in any of the trees, but especially in the alder, would, well, let me tell you the story. Once upon a time, there was a man called Tam, and he lived in a cottage in the woods, and he had the best well in the whole village. His well had the sweetest, clearest water, and it had an alder tree that grew right next to it. And everybody loved Tam's water, and they would come and they would take it. And it was such a brilliant well that he would be able to store his butter and his milk down there in the bucket, and even pork. He would have a piece of pork every Christmas day, whereas other people wouldn't be able to keep it unless they salted it. He would have this piece of pork with crispy crackling because of his well. Now, Tam had lived in this place for a very long time, and this alder had been there a very long time too. And the branch, the big thick branch that came from the bottom, was coming up and over the well. And every year it grew further over and over. And one spring, Tam had got used to the branch being there, and then the leaves started to come. And every time he went to that well, he had to get the branch out of the way before he could put his bucket in to bring up the water. And he would just moan and curse every single time. And as the season went on through, the leaves got thicker and thicker. And he would moan. And when he moaned to other people about it, people said, "Don't you do anything to that tree. You know what they say about the alder tree, Tam. Don't. Oh, you don't live here. You don't have these problems with your well." But the crunch came when in the autumn, when the leaves started to fall from the trees, they went into the well. And Tam was so convinced that they changed the water. They made the water sour. He would taste it and go, "Oh, this bloomin' tree." But one day he lost his cool completely. He went back to his cottage. He got his saw, or his axe actually, got his axe, and he came back and he started to chop the tree. Well, the very first chop, there was a scream that came out from the tree. And he stopped, because not only was there a scream, but he thought he could smell smoke, and he put his axe down and he turned around and he went back to his house, and he hadn't even lit a fire that day, so it's nothing. So he went back and he took the axe again, and as he chopped there was another scream and there was a kind of a crackle, and he looked and he could see smoke, and he went back to his little cottage and there was nothing. So this time he picked up his axe and he says, "Listen to me," he says, "I'm going to get rid of this branch once and for all. None of your tricks." And he took that axe and he chopped and he chopped, and every single time that blade hit the trunk of the tree, there was a scream, and every single time there was a crackle, and smoke started to build up all around him. And he said, I'm not taking any notice." And he chopped until that branch came away. And he had that branch in his hand, and he turned around and he saw smoke coming from his cottage. And then he saw the people from the village were running down to him and saying, Tam, your house is on fire." But by that point, it was too late. It was too late to get any water from the well. The fire just burnt down, took the house with it to the ground. Well, you could be sure, from that time on, everybody in that village made sure that they passed on to the next generation, you never, ever cut down an alder tree.
There is a story about a husband and wife. Oh my goodness me, how they love one another. There was never such a love. They lived in a little cottage, in a little garden surrounded by a forest like this. Every day they would go into their garden and they would work together. And you know what? Do you know what? They only grew one thing: roses. Red roses everywhere, up the sides of the walls of the cottage, over the roof, up the trees, everywhere, red roses. They adored them, and the garden was getting older and older and more beautiful. Their love was getting stronger and stronger, and then one evening, an evening probably like this, they were standing outside of the cottage, admiring the garden, seeing all the roses, and the husband said to the wife, "Do you know, I don't think that the roses have ever looked as beautiful as they do this evening. What do you think?" "Yes," she said, "my husband, I know you are right. We should have a celebration," he said. "We should have a fine meal, some good wine. Yes," she said, "I'll go and start cooking." And she went into the cottage, and he stood there and he looked. "This will be a fine evening," he said. And he went in, and he went across the hallway, and he went into the kitchen. He says to my wife, "What do you think you should cook? What do you want me to do?" And he looked around, and the kitchen was empty. She wasn't there. "My wife, where are you? I don't understand." So he went into the dining room. "My wife, what are you doing?" "Oh no, of course she's probably gone into the back garden." So he went back to the kitchen, to the back door, and he opened. But when he went to open the door, he realized the key was in the lock, and the door was locked. So he went into the hallway and looked up the stairs. "My wife, are you upstairs?" So he went up the stairs and he went into the bedroom. "Is this a game? Should we have..." "My wife, you're not here. Why is..." So he went into the spare room. "My wife, what is going on?" And he came down the stairs. "Where are you? Where are you?" But he couldn't find her anywhere. He looked and he looked and he looked. And then he realized it was a game. But when he was back in the kitchen, he could see the kitchen table. And next to the kitchen table, there was a trapdoor. There was a cellar down below, and that was where all the wine was. She was hiding down there. That's what she was doing. So he lifted up the trapdoor, and he went down the stairs. My wife... But when he got down there, nothing. She wasn't there. I don't understand. My wife, I'm getting scared. This is not funny anymore. Please come out from wherever you're hiding. But she didn't appear. Well, he didn't eat that night, and he didn't sleep. And the next day he went into the garden, and he went around, and he looked after the roses, and he cried, and he came back inside. My wife, where are you? I don't understand. He cooked a little meal that night, and all he could think about was, where's my wife? Where is she? I don't understand. She must be somewhere. And every day was the same. Couldn't find her. Night after night he could not sleep, and he stopped eating. He didn't know what to do, and the weeks became a month, and 2 months, and 3 months, and he was so sad. Where was my wife? It was such a fine evening. 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 months went by. And then, on the day after the 12 months, a year and a day, he was in the kitchen, he was cooking a little meal, when he suddenly heard scratch, 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 scratch. And he looked at the window, and there she was, outside, scratching at the window. Oh, my wife! And he ran to the back door, and he unlocked it, and he went out there, and there she was, and she was so thin. And he caught hold of her, and he carried her in, and he placed her on a chair in the kitchen. He said, my wife, where on earth have you been? What has happened to you? And she looked at me and she said, oh, my husband, I had no idea. What? What is it? Tell me. Everywhere there are ghosts. And they have been watching us for so long, and they were jealous of us. And that night when I came into the house, they stole me away. They took me away. What do you mean? They took you away? Where did they take you? They took me into our garden. What? I've been in the garden for a year and a day, but I haven't seen you. No, she said. They turned me into one of the roses. You've been turned into a rose all this time? Yes, she said. And I could see you coming and going, and I couldn't speak. And I begged with the ghost, please let me go home to my husband, please let me go home. And eventually they said, you can go home for one night. And this is what they do. They said that I was to tell you that I could only stay with you this night. And when the sun rises and comes through the window of the door, I will leave you. And I will go back to being a rose. And this is what you must do, my husband. You must find me. You must find me, and you can only make one choice. If you make the wrong choice, you will never see me again. So you have to find me. But how will I know? How will I know which one is you? That is your problem, she said. But think quickly. We don't have many hours. So he sat there and he thought and he thought and he thought. I know. But no, that wouldn't work. No, that wouldn't work either. No, that wouldn't work either. What if... no, that wouldn't work. No, that wouldn't work. No, I don't know. I really don't know. Husband, be quick. Look, it's getting light. Quickly. I can hear the birds singing. Quickly. The sun will come up and then I will leave. How are you going to find me? I know, she said. And as she opened her mouth to tell her husband, the sunlight came through the window of the door and touched her lips, and as soon as it did, she could not speak. And unseen hands, the hands of ghosts, began to lift her up out of that chair. Other unseen hands began to open the door of the front of the cottage, and other unseen hands began to push her out. And the husband was watching her. Where are you going? Where are you going? Because he couldn't see the ghost, and by the time he got outside, nothing. Just roses, red roses everywhere. Oh, which one are you? Oh, my wife, couldn't you tell me? How am I meant to know which one you are? And I only have one choice. So that's your problem. This is your dilemma now. You only have one choice. You can ask a friend perhaps, but you only have one choice, and if you get it wrong, that's it. How is he going to find his wife? How will he know which rose is her? Somebody once told me, of course it will be the one without any dew on it, because she wasn't outside at night. It's a good answer. Wasn't right. Somebody else said, oh, I know what it would be. It would be the rose without any thorns. I thought that was quite a nice answer. Somebody else said it was a white rose because I just reminded them that they were all red. It's your dilemma. How is he going to find her? I suppose you'd like to know. Sometimes storytellers like to play games. Why should I tell you? Why shouldn't I let you have that little gnawing feeling inside that you don't really know? Because I'm not going to tell you. Of course, there could be many different answers, but really there's only one. I wonder if I should tell you. Or should I leave it till next year? Of course, the answer is this. When he went outside, when he looked around, when he got over the panic, he did what he knew he should do. He shut his eyes. He calmed himself. And when he opened them, and he looked, of course, he said, there you are. You see, the answer to the riddle is this, and it's simple. He loved her so much that once he connected with his heart, he knew which rose was his wife.